You're listening to the STEMxm podcast, highlighting women in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And now, your host, Mel the Engineer.
Hello, and thank you for joining us here for episode 24 of the STEMxm podcast. I'm your host, Mel the Engineer. Here on STEMxm, my goal is to showcase some of the many career paths in science, tech, engineering, and math while highlighting women who are rocking it in these fields. I also try to get our guests to talk about some of the scientific or technical aspects about their work. People are often passionate about the work they do in these fields, and I love to help them share some of that passion through the podcast. Now let's get to today's episode. We have a theoretical ecologist, Dr. Emily Moberg, joining us. Emily's research has been focused on the feedbacks between wild populations and human influences. She recently completed her PhD in biological oceanography in the joint program between the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. She's currently conducting postdoctoral research at Rutgers and Yale with Professors Pinsky and Finichel. More specifically, part of what we'll be discussing today with Emily is the impact that rising ocean temperature has on fish populations. So this is the second in a mini-series here we're doing on climate change careers and research. So let's dive right in, and I'll be back with you at the end of the show to discuss show notes. Moberg, and welcome to STEMxm.
Thank you. It's really great to be here.
So I want to start with some questions about your early life. Could you tell us where you grew up?
So I grew up outside of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, in I guess the suburbs. Yeah, it's a really beautiful place. I don't think I really appreciated how wonderful the outdoors of Pennsylvania are until I moved away and went to school in Boston. But yeah, it's a very nice kind of mixture between having lots of people and houses and having some really great outdoor spaces with lots of trees and grass and all that type of nice greenery.
So you said you didn't appreciate nature as much as you think you should have back then, but were you interested in science as a kid?
Yeah, I was, and I think still am to some extent, interested in everything. I definitely have very fond memories of when I was younger going out and trying to catch as many salamanders as possible, and then very ineffectually and probably not very great for the salamanders, trying to raise them in small plastic bins and feeding them insects, which I'm not actually sure is what they eat. Which is why I think the salamanders did not fare very well. No, I mean, I think really, at least on the Pennsylvania front, I think I just really took for granted our outside spaces and thought, oh, the great outdoor spaces are way out west in those really dramatic landscapes. And then, moving away for a while, I came back and was like, oh, this place is great. Our forests are great. They're great hiking trails, all this type of stuff. But yeah, no, I mean, I think I've often been, when I was younger, interested in why things were working the way they did, what things were, and the type of information that science provided, I just thought was really cool.
That's really awesome. Okay, so you had this interest early on. When you were in high school, did you have an idea of what your path was going to be like in college, or did that develop over time?
So, I mean, in early high school, I definitely did not. I don't think I would have even told you that I was going to pursue science at all. I was definitely kind of interested in everything. I was really fortunate to do an environmental science competition in high school, which definitely exposed me to a lot of really cool information and opportunities. And I think helped kind of bend me towards the environmental sciences in particular. But even when I was applying to college, I think I was kind of thinking, well, maybe I'll do political science, maybe I'll do physics. And I think I was reading an article in a magazine that was talking in particular about so many of the social issues that were going on throughout the world. And the thing that stuck out to me in reading that, which I think was actually the article itself, was more about the subjugation of women in certain parts of the world, was that the parts of the world they were talking about are also parts of the world that really have a lot of environmental degradation and not great access to a lot of clean water and those types of things. And that really got me interested in the linkages between the environment and human health. So I then went into environmental engineering for my undergraduate degree.
Okay, that's really interesting. So I want to go back for a second. This environmental science competition, how did you get into that? What took you into that, and was there an organization behind it that was running that? And what was your project?
Yeah, so the competition is called Envirothon. It's actually an international competition. I know it's at least the United States and Canada. I'm not sure if there's anyone else at this point. But there's local, state level, and then the international competition. I was actually invited to be on the team based on my performance in my freshman year classes. And I was very flattered to be invited to this very prestigious team at school. So I said, of course I'll do it. That sounds fantastic. Because I'm a rather competitive person on the whole. So yeah, so I agreed to do that. My particular topic was aquatic ecology. The competition as a whole has 5 topics, soils, forestry, wildlife, aquatic ecology, and current events. And yeah, there was a nice little team structure within our school. I had an older partner who, kind of served as my mentor and who had been on the team for 2 years prior to that. So it was a really great kind of little family. And I was lucky in that our team, really were kind of all in and took it very seriously. So we did very well.
That's awesome. Okay, so you did that, and that had some influence. Then when you got to college, was there anything specific that you can think of that kind of led you into environmental engineering specifically?
I actually applied to my undergraduate school saying I wanted to do environmental engineering. After I I did a Google search and said, okay, I think I'm really interested in something about the environment, but I'm also really interested in doing things and, taking action. Is there something that combines both of those things? And apparently when you type in, I want to do things with science, engineering pops up. And so then environmental engineering popped up, and I said, okay, that sounds cool. And so when I showed up in undergrad, I, looked at the classes that were offered and started taking them and was really enjoying them. So I stuck with that.
Okay, that's awesome. So while you were earning your undergrad degree, did you do any internships or any undergraduate research?
Yeah, so my first internship was at the University of Pennsylvania in a sediment dynamics lab, which was a really phenomenal experience for me. The PI, the professor, was just setting up his lab. So I got to work on, really helping set things up. And the grad student and I actually spent a lot of time kind of dumpster diving across Penn's campus looking for useful things that we needed. So at one point, I think we scavenged a space heater and a window and some pieces of plywood that we put together to make a little dryer to dry dirt sediment that we were using after it had gotten wet, because it turned out that it would take weeks on its own to dry, and we were hoping to get that down to days. So I'm 100% sure that was a fire hazard, but we had a lot of fun building it.
So before you go forward, what is sediment dynamics, and what was the research y'all were working on there?
So sediment dynamics is basically, sediment is like dirt that is particularly in water. and the dynamics just refers to its movement. So the research was focused on how small particles in water settle out, in particular in deltas, and they form what are called alluvial fans. And you get, in particular, little channels. So if you're on the beach, sometimes you'll see there's these little kind of channels that form in water, so like little rivulets rather than, just flat beach. And so we were interested in how those channels form, and in particular, whether you need something like vegetation to provide structure so that those channels can form, or whether different properties of the sediment, so sand versus clay or whatever, can on their own give rise to those channels. So we were doing, we actually had this big kind of bathtub like thing that we were using and running water mixed with these little tiny plastic beads and some sand through it. And they were different colors. So we also spent some time spray painting sand, which I do not recommend. Not a good activity. And then used like lasers and videos to try to figure out what the formations that were being made from these small particles were.
Okay, that's really cool. Yeah. So I just want to interject and tell the audience that it might sound strange, right? Like you think about dirt moving around, like who cares about that? But it has that type of study has all kinds of implications for other things, whether it's geotechnical engineering and how soil moves when there's an earthquake, or how it behaves when you put a certain structure on it, or things like that. But the settling out that you mentioned too, there's all kinds of applications of fluid dynamics that are important to our lives that we may not know about. Like, when you mentioned settling out, it made me think about how they do backwashes on filters at a drinking water treatment plant. So you might have an actual sand filter there, and you backwash it, and you've got several different types of media in there, and how those settle out. That has to be modeled in advance so that it settles the way that you want it to, sort of thing. So that stuff is pretty interesting. So it's cool that you got to work in a lab like that as an undergrad. That's awesome.
Yeah, I was also really fortunate. So the professor I was working with, Professor Gerald Mack, who was amazing, also insisted that I learn how to code, which I didn't know how to do at that point, and it sounded quite intimidating. And I think, what he told me to start was, this is really useful. What I'm asking you to do, I could do it in a couple of hours, and it's going to take you weeks, and it's going to be so frustrating, but you're going to be a much better scientist if you know how to do this. So give it a try, and if you get stuck for more than a couple of days, come ask me.
That's awesome. That's some foresight there. I'm sure you're glad now that you did it, right?
Oh, I mean, honestly, I was glad probably a couple days in, because it was just it was a new language. And I've always loved learning other languages, like, French type foreign languages. And I was really fascinated by the kind of doors that being able to program could open. And so even though I was terrible at it, I had a lot of fun trying to figure out, okay, how can I express what I want to happen in this language? And then how can I figure out whether or not I did the thing that I wanted to do? And, that skill, I think more than any other, has been so useful. Although I think a lot of the other ways of thinking about things. So he also made sure that we read papers and gave me the great advice that you should probably spend about half an hour reading a single page if you're really reading a paper, which I think just really gave me an idea of, okay, I'm being asked to really think and to really process and understand at a level that, I hadn't necessarily been asked to do before. So that was a really great entree to that for me.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds like a great professor. And at that time, what language were you coding in?
So I was coding in Octave, actually, which is the freeware version of MATLAB.
All right, thank you for answering all the questions on that. So that was one thing you did one summer, and then what else happened for you?
Yeah, so let's see, I think the next summer I worked at the Army Corps of Engineers in their engineering research division out in Lexington, Massachusetts. And in particular, I was helping out with, they were working, again, still on sediment and water, but we're looking at both kind of environmental models and also we're interested in the toxicity of different sediments in certain waterways. And so I was helping them figuring out the different properties of different contaminants so that they could put those properties into a larger model to help understand, how damaging dredging up those sediments might be. Yeah, so it was a lot, it was a very different experience because there was still research, but it was much more applied. And I think it made me realize how different the government and kind of the direct applications of a lot of this stuff are from kind of pure research, which can be a couple of steps ahead and behind at the same time.
That's an interesting comment. Can you tell us a little more about what you mean by that?
Well, so I mean, I think in some ways, I think I was a bit enamored saying, oh, there's this other model we could be using that's, kind of very current and, felt very novel. And so I would say in that way, the people in academia were maybe doing things that are a bit ahead, but at the same time, the people who I was talking to there actually were working in these systems and really understood what was needed and said, okay, that model's great, but there's no way we're going to be able to collect the data for that model in the time we need to do the project, so it's not helpful. And so I think in that way, then they're, a couple of steps ahead because they're actually working with these systems and trying to understand, well, what are we actually going to be able to do in terms of environmental impact assessments and what type of data do we need for that. And so it was, again, just very different.
Awesome. Okay, so then what were there more than that? Was there another summer that you did research or intern somewhere?
Yeah. So I also then, so I in college at one point took a limnology class, which is about the study of lakes. And by this point, from what we've talked about thus far, I was kind of very much down the water and dirt and water route of what I was intellectually interested in. And in this limnology class, so we're learning about lakes, we touched upon fish, so some of the things that live in lakes and how some of the chemical and properties and dirt and water can influence what lives there. And I was like, oh, that's awesome. And I guess that kind of tapped back into my interest in things that are alive. And I asked my professor of the class about that. I said, hey, this is really cool, studying animals that live in lakes. Where can I learn more about this? And so he encouraged me to apply to a summer fellowship at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, which I did, and ended up working there for a summer with a scientist named Heidi Sosik, who also is from an environmental engineering background. And there I had the amazing opportunity to work with, we were looking at this time series of photographs of individual phytoplankton, so tiny ocean plant cells. So you can't even see them with your naked eye, but we were looking at magnified images of them from this site that they had out off Martha's Vineyard. It was taking about 1,000 to 2,000 pictures every 20 minutes for the last couple of years. So millions of photos of individual cells. And, you can tell a lot about what's going on by looking at this time series of who's there, which, species of cells are there. And what she kind of had me working on was how big the cells are. So I was looking at making code to figure out how much stuff would have been in the cells if we had like a 3D model of them. And we were also interested in understanding how they were then changing their size and also their chlorophyll content over the course of the season. And that really then got me very hooked on ecology and having living things in my water again.
So that's really fascinating. You have these millions of photographs, and so it sounds like part of what your team had to do was code a program to look through the photographs and kind of characterize them by these criteria that you described, like size and chlorophyll content and whatnot.
Yeah, so I kind of was just working on a small part of what they do. They actually had really incredible automated systems. So both looking at things like the texture. So what does the surface of the cell kind of look like? What's its shape? Um, you know, is it long and skinny, or does it have a sphere? And they actually were using some pretty sophisticated automatic classification algorithms to automatically identify what they were. And I think they've gotten more sophisticated since I left. So I was then interested in furthering how they determined. So, like, right, if you have a 2D image, you can determine the area. And we wanted to make some simple assumptions about that third dimension that you can't see, that kind of into the page dimension, and have that automatically calculate a volume with those assumptions, which turns out to be a little bit tricky, especially to do quickly. And with, so many images quickly is actually a big issue, because some of the methods I tried would have taken years to run.
You're listening to episode 24 of the STEMxm podcast. I'm your host, Mel the Engineer, and today we're speaking with theoretical ecologist Dr. Emily Moberg. And so tell us about what was the next step to that? So this, after the analysis was done to see how these little things are living in that spot over time, what could your team discern from that? What did that tell you?
Okay, well, so I'm trying to think. That lab, which I don't work in that area anymore, but they've been doing all sorts of incredible things. So a colleague of mine with similar data ended up making this incredible model where she was tracking. So it's very difficult, right, if you're kind of just counting the number of cells out in the ocean to figure out how many were born versus how many got eaten, because these processes are happening simultaneously and very rapidly. And so she made this incredible model where they were actually looking at that size structure throughout the day to try to back out exactly how quickly the population was growing. Because that size structure gives you information about the growth of the cells, just not the number, in a way that's a little bit unprecedented. So that's some of the directions they're going. And I think they've also been doing some cool stuff with kind of microfluidics and trying to improve not just being able to take pictures, but also be able to kind of like sort cells in situ in the ocean as well. And then that type of information can also be used for understanding how organisms are feeding. There's another person in that laboratory who looks more at the very small predators that eat those very tiny ocean plants. So you can also start looking kind of up the food chain and saying, okay, if we see changes in this community composition throughout the season, what drives that? Are we seeing long-term changes over time with climate change? Or are we seeing changes that are likely to propagate up to other organisms that we might care about?
Okay, so was that the last one that you wanted to tell us about?
Sure. Those are the kind of 3 summers in undergrad before I started grad school. I did a couple of small research projects in undergrad as well, which I got a lot out of, more on the kind of fluid dynamics side. And I'm also really good at injecting dye into tiny plastic beads as a result of that. You pick up really weird skills in research that are probably not ever going to be useful again, but like you're really good at like some very strange thing. And then also a little bit, I worked on some autonomous underwater vehicles, but I'm not actually sure I was very helpful on that project, so we can gloss over that.
Okay. Well, why don't you walk us through kind of the next steps in your timeline? Did you did you go to work somewhere, or did you decide to go straight for a PhD? And how did you make these decisions?
Yeah, so after my amazing summer working at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution with the phytoplankton, I decided I wanted to go to grad school kind of in that area and continue using kind of what I considered math tools to study organisms in particular and kind of the ecology of how organisms are interacting with their environment. So I started applying to grad school, and Dr. Sosek again was amazing and really helped me get my applications in, even though I'm a bit of a chronic procrastinator and left a couple things to the embarrassing last minute. I remember this one moment where I think I was surrounded, like the whole living room was pieces of cut out paper and like sticky notes of multiple colors and like glue everywhere because I was trying to cut my essay into pieces and reorganize it into something that made sense. And I was sleep deprived, and it sounded like a good idea to take scissors and tape and glue and colored pencils and have them be all over the floor. It did eventually turn into an essay, but it would have been a lot more sane if I'd left, more than 2 days ahead of doing it. But yeah, so I was really grateful to have that kind of support and mentorship throughout that period. And then, so then I ended up talking to a number of professors at different graduate institutions, working on things from, bees to seabirds, and the lab I ended up working with does more marine stuff. And in particular, I ended up then kind of focusing on fisheries bioeconomics, which is still what I do.
Awesome. So talk to us about how you landed on this particular research, and I'm guessing you did a master's, and did that carry straight over into your PhD work? Did they kind of run together?
So I actually don't have a master's degree. I knew I wanted to get a PhD, and so I applied just to PhD programs. And at least the program I was in doesn't typically do a master's on the way. So I kind of went all in.
Nice. Okay, so here's what I've been really wanting to ask you. Okay, so can you describe for us what types of impacts climate change has on the water bodies that you research, and how do we know that those impacts are indeed coming from climate change? Can you kind of walk us through that?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I guess just to start us off, I want to make sure we're on the same page with what we're talking about for climate change. So, when we as humans burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas for energy or to power our cars, we end up releasing carbon dioxide as part of that, and that carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide has this interesting property that when it's in the atmosphere, it acts rather like a heat trapping blanket and keeps heat close to the earth that would otherwise radiate back into space. So when we burn these fossil fuels, we're releasing more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which kind of acts to thicken this heat trapping blanket and therefore keeps more heat close to the earth than there would be normally. So this excess heat ends up raising the temperature of the atmosphere. Now, a lot of that heat ends up not just in the atmosphere, but also going into the ocean. Actually, most of it ends up in the ocean. So we've seen what seem like relatively small, but when you think about how large the planet is, are kind of huge increases in temperature for both the ocean and for the atmosphere over the last century. So when we're talking about climate change, that's the kind of process that we're talking about, that enrichment of carbon dioxide and then extra heat that gets trapped closer to the earth. Okay, so then next you asked me about what does that excess heat do? And the answer is so many things. So if I focus on fish, so I'll kind of use them as a case study. But so fish, for example, are basically what we typically call cold-blooded, and they're immersed in their water, their whole lives. And so a lot of their function, their metabolism, how many babies they have, how often they get diseases, how quickly they die, all of those rates depend on temperature. And so when the environment they're in is changing and becomes warmer, that can really alter how successful they are in their whole life history. And when you look at the signal for, fish, for example, we actually see that a lot of these species are kind of tracking the temperature that they historically would have been at. So they're kind of following those changes in temperature. So, going towards the poles, or in some cases shifting deeper to cooler waters. Now, of course, there can be trade-offs in terms of where spawning grounds might be, or, a location that has a really great temperature in the fall might not have a great temperature at a different time of year. So they're not always able to perfectly track their thermal niche. So we can have populations that are also in a lot of trouble because they can't follow their thermal niche. And then we can also have organisms who are no longer interacting necessarily with the same other organisms because they're shifting at different rates, perhaps. I guess this is when we start getting into there's so many things that are possible as organisms are responding to this change in their environment.
Right. Okay. So there's lots of implications here for this thermal tracking that you're describing. I'm guessing if, like you just said, if a certain species doesn't interact with another species that it normally would, that has implications on population as well. And I mean, I have to think that if they have to shift their geography, so to speak, this greatly, that could also have implications on how successful they are in making babies.
Yeah, and depending on which species you're talking about, and particularly what life histories they kind of do, some fish go through crazy huge migrations, across half the world, and some eat very specific prey items, some will eat anything. So there's a lot of heterogeneity across different species, which is, I think, sometimes why we can get a little bit muddled in terms of thinking, why is this important? Because the answer can depend so much on who exactly we're talking about and even which region of the world we're talking about. So for example, if we're talking about the tropics, there aren't necessarily fish from warmer waters to move into those areas because they're already the warmest. So that might look really different when we're thinking about the biodiversity or biomass in that region relative to somewhere that's a little bit more temperate.
Right. Okay, well, let's talk for a moment more specifically about research that you have conducted. Can you tell us a little bit about maybe a couple of the questions that you've tried to answer and how you have gone about trying to answer those questions in your research?
Yeah, I love talking about my research. The bigger challenge will be to get me to stop talking about it, really. So the type of work I do, so I'm a theoretical ecologist, which means that I use math and often computer code to try to understand things about natural populations. So kind of broadly, if you or anyone listening is thinking, why would you be using math to understand fish? Fish live in the water, math does not. It's kind of the same as doing an experiment to some extent, except that the thing that you're testing is, with equations. So equations to some extent are just rules. So they're assumptions. The same way that you make controls in an experiment, we're actually explicitly writing down kind of what assumptions we're making into those equations. And we can, with those equations, describe systems that are somewhat complicated. And then we can ask questions about those systems and try to understand what sets of rules can give rise to, certain types of behavior. So I'm really interested in looking at the interface of ecology, so studying how organisms interact with each other in their environment, and economics, which I like to describe as understanding how humans interact with each other and their environment, or their environment that we can consume. And so, fisheries is a great case study for that, because fish interact with each other in their environment, and then humans, we like to catch fish and sometimes sell them or eat them. So some of the questions that I've looked at, I did a project where we were looking at a kind of single population and considering if its growth rate or its reproductive rate was declining over time. So the kind of idea there was, if we have, an environment that's warming perhaps, or is impacted by another pollutant, and that's negatively impacting the growth, how would a fisherman who wants to maximize the amount of profit she's getting from that system, how would she harvest that population? And we can use mathematical tools to actually kind of prescribe over time, here's how much she would catch in one year, and here's how much she would catch in the next. And we can look at those patterns and say, okay, yes, there's something interesting when it's the reproductive rate that changes, and it's a bit more expected, or what we expected, when it's the mortality rate that's increasing, for example. So those tend to be the types of questions that I'm interested in asking.
You're listening to STEMxm. This episode is the second in a series on climate change careers in science. You can listen to this episode again on iTunes, Stitcher, or directly on this episode's show notes page at STEMxm.com/episode 24. I would be so grateful also if you'd consider sharing the STEMxm podcast as a resource to students, teachers, or school counselors you know who might find this information useful. I'm Mel the Engineer, and thank you for listening. So you've completed your PhD and you're doing additional postdoc research now. Is that similar? Is that related?
Yes. So I actually am doing almost embarrassingly similar work. Although in my postdoctoral work, the lab I'm with is really strong in using a lot of the fishery survey trawl data that NOAA collects. So the National Marine Fisheries Service actually goes out twice a year and takes surveys of the fish in the water at a whole bunch of different locations. And it's this incredible data set that goes back, in some cases, I think like the 1960s. And so they're really great about using a lot of this data to answer questions about, potential interspecies interactions. So which species are kind of found together. And we're also working some on some spatial models to try to understand and see if we can tease apart some of the influences of changing environment versus changes in human harvest, with some pretty nifty and almost magical statistics. Are always kind of magical to me, kind of statistical tools. So I've kind of added some more, or gone back maybe to my roots from the phytoplankton, at looking at some larger data sets to try to understand what's going on from that perspective.
So in carrying out this kind of research, what do you think is the most exciting sort of implication for how it could help us?
I mean, so my research or research in general?
I think your research in general, right? Because, I mean, at the very least, I would think some of this information, could help us understand how we can fish responsibly, right? Because, for a lot of people, that's their livelihood, and then that's also a big food source.
Yeah, so I mean, I think from the theoretical perspective, the way that I at least like to think about it is that it helps us to build intuition, and also I think helps build kind of what the rules of thumb are. So, the very specific nitty gritty of how much in, um, pounds one is going to be allowed to catch of a specific stock, that, is a very specific question that I don't get at. But I think the intuition for should we be fishing more or less as conditions deteriorate? Or if we see these types of interactions between species, so they're competing or they're predator prey interactions, should we be altering how we harvest, yes or no? Or should we harvest more or harvest less in that situation? Or if we're considering those types of things, we want to add them to our model, and we want to add them to what we're considering, kind of qualitatively, is it important? Should we be considering it? I think that's kind of the level at which the work I do is important and, hopefully one day transformative for considering fisheries, especially the ones that are undergoing change.
Right, absolutely. So, what do you think you will do in the future? Because you're kind of on the cusp, right, of coming into this. Well, I was going to ask if you see yourself in academia, but maybe that's not your path. What do you see yourself doing after your postdoc work?
That's a really great question, and one that I am definitely kind of always assessing and thinking about. At this point, um, I really am interested in following a path that lets me ask really interesting questions and find answers and new knowledge. That's something that's important to me. And I'm also really excited about doing things like this and trying to share and have conversations with people about these topics, because I'm excited about them and I hope other people can be excited too, especially on the math end, which I think gets a bad rap for not being useful. And I think math is super awesome and super useful all the time. Um, and so, yeah, I really would love to be able to continue doing that type of communication and talking with people about that. And also, whether that's in an informal setting or whether that's in a more formal classroom setting, like at a university. Uh, yeah, so those are some of the things I'm really passionate about doing. And, we'll see kind of what the future holds with respect to what type of institution ends up being the best fit for me in terms of actually doing those things.
Right. Okay. So your path is open, and I'm sure it'll be a really interesting one. I'm sure you'll get to work on some fascinating questions. So I'm going to go backwards for a second. I may cut this piece and put it backwards, but I want to ask you, is there anything about climate change that you learned during the course of your research that you found really fascinating or poignant?
So, I think the coolest thing about climate change is the paleoclimate research. So, it's the research that focuses on how we know about the ancient climate, whether that's a couple hundred years ago or thousands or even millions of years ago. Um, I know this is probably embarrassing coming from a scientist, but like statistics, um, the paleoclimatology seems like magic to me. They can see back in time, and they use crazy, creative, amazing techniques to be able to get these little snapshots back in time. So, they'll use ice cores and take measurements from specific layers there to try to analyze the chemicals or the gases in there. Take cores from corals to understand how quickly corals were growing in different ocean temperatures. and, piece that together with information we have about atmospheric conditions or oceanic conditions. Same with lake sediments or pollens. It's just this whole suite of really cool measurements that people have linked together with laboratory measurements and models, and have really let us see into the past very specifically to say, okay, the atmospheric conditions looked like this, and here's what the temperature was, and here's how the animal community was organized. And learning about that just really kind of blew my mind. And I thought, wow, okay, I want to always make sure I'm talking to the paleoclimate people and just learning about that and making sure we're using that knowledge to, project forward, and also just thinking creatively about how can we do this science in a cool way to learn something that might not be easy to get at. Yeah, it's seriously like magic. It's so cool.
Okay, so I'm going to shift gears here a little bit, and I want to ask you, do you have any recommendations or any advice that you would give to a young aspiring scientist? So somebody who is in high school, or somebody who's maybe early on in college, and they're interested in this path, but maybe they're not quite sure what to do.
So my advice to people who are interested in science, first is, yay, that's awesome. Okay, do it. And then hopefully, after like 5 minutes of that, I'll like calm down and offer some real advice, but there's no guarantees of that. So at first I would say definitely talk to people. Find people either at your school, or if that's not available, maybe within the community, to talk to and learn about what they do and, why they like it. I think that those types of conversations are so valuable for just learning what's out there. The second thing that I would really encourage, and this is because I didn't do it and I think it's come back to bite me a little bit, is I sometimes get overly convinced that I know what is interesting and what is not and write things off. And I would really encourage people to not write off subjects. So in undergrad, I, heard my friends doing an economics problem set, and they were talking about the marginal value of the last rose on Valentine's Day, and I scoffed and said, that sounds so silly. I am not interested in this. And so I did not take economics in undergrad. And then I got to grad school and took a class and thought, oh my gosh, this is fascinating. I can totally see how I can use this with my research in ecology. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I didn't take any classes in this. And, then was kind of not struggling, well, yeah, a little bit, to catch up and learn these new things because I just had chosen not to explore it earlier. And so I think being open-minded and saying, yes, I'm going to check this out. It might not be what I want to do, but I might learn something really cool from it, like that paleoclimatology is magic. Or it might, open how I think in a new way, or it might also be something that I say, yes, if I combine this with this, I'm going to get something really cool. So explore and don't write off topics, right away, especially if you haven't tried them first.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece of advice. It's nobody's ever given that piece of advice on my show before, and I think that's such a great recommendation, because it's just like you mentioned earlier, where math gets a bad rap, and it shouldn't. I mean, maybe you've had bad teachers along the way, but it's almost any subject can be interesting and useful and applicable to something in your life if you've got the right teacher, if you've got the right curiosity and you dig down into it. So I definitely love that. I love that piece of advice. That's great.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing with that, too, is that so many subjects also are just so much bigger than you kind of first realize. So you can say something like, oh, well, I don't like, math. And it's like, well, do you not like algebra? Do you not like statistics? Do you not like geometry? Because, there are some aspects of math that I do not like. And there's some aspects that I absolutely love and adore. And so I think that's the other thing to be careful of, too, is not to paint too much of a broad brush on subjects when, in fact, there are lots of sub-subjects, like chemistry. Put me in a lab, I'm a disaster, I will break everything and probably blow something up. Chemistry that involves equations, totally fine with that. I love it. It's great. So I think sometimes those nuances can be important too in terms of keeping, thinking about, well, what exactly do you like or dislike? Because science is a big, big topic.
Okay, so my last question for you, do you know of any resources where somebody could go to learn more about theoretical ecology?
As much as I would love to send people to the peer-reviewed literature first, I think that actually checking out websites like Wikipedia are often a good place to start to, learn a little bit about a topic. In terms of other resources, I have to think about that. Unfortunately, the theoretical ecology in general, like often, there's a couple textbooks that I really like, but in terms of a quick, hey, yeah, just take a glance at this, I don't think there's quite as much as there should be, and they're probably not books that are going to be available in a non-university library either, which is unfortunate.
What about ecology in general? Are there any organizations that students might be interested in looking into getting involved with?
Yeah, I know the Ecological Society of America, and there are ecological societies in many other countries too, like Britain has a ecological society as well that is significantly older, I think, than the one in America. But anyway, so there are ecological societies that are national organizations that often have national conferences, and also have members all over the country that are great resources, and often try to get students more involved, which is really great and a great opportunity. I think that's especially easy for college students, as that's a demographic that those organizations are often really interested in, and I think really try to support those students getting research or opportunities through that. I would say on the high school level, the competition that I did, the Envirothon competition, is a really great way to get an introduction to a lot of ecology. And I think basically every state has, the competition. So that's one way to get started in that. There are resources online kind of that each state provides to learn about the ecology of your state in particular.
Definitely. Okay, well then I'll look that up and I'll be sure to include a link to that in the show notes. All right, well, we're coming up on time, so I want to thank you, Emily, for joining us here today on STEMxm. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was great to talk with you.
I hope you enjoyed my chat with Dr. Moberg. Emily does have an online presence, so if you'd like to learn more about her work or reach out to her directly, visit indoorecologist.wordpress.com. You can find this episode's show notes at STEMxm.com/episode 24. That's STEMxm.com/episode and then the number 24. Again, I want to thank you for downloading and listening to the STEMxm podcast and this episode in particular. If there's a specific career that you would like to hear about, I'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to me on Twitter, where the handle is just STEMxm Podcast. And you can also go to STEMxm.com, where you can find details about all the episodes. You can contact me from there via email, and you can sign up for the STEMxm newsletter. Thank you again, listeners, and I'll be back with you in episode 25 with a coral reef expert, and she's going to talk with us about some of the impacts that climate change has on coral reefs. So stay tuned, and I'll chat with you then. Bye.
This has been an episode of the STEMxm podcast. Thank you for listening. We would really love if you could pop over to iTunes and give us an honest, positive rating. It helps more listeners find us to learn about STEM careers. Thanks again, cheers, and we'll catch you on the next episode.